By the middle years of World War II, the skies over Europe were filled with the sound of British bombers. Every night, they crossed the Channel, carrying tons of explosives meant to cripple Hitler's war machine. But while German cities burned, one part of Hitler's empire seemed untouchable. Across occupied Europe, the Nazis had carved a hidden network of fortresses, U-boat pens, rocket launch bunkers, and command centers buried deep beneath concrete and steel. These were not ordinary buildings. They were monsters of architecture, walls 20 feet thick, ceilings reinforced with layers of rebar, designed to shrug off anything the Allies could drop from the sky. The British called them no-bomb zones. The Germans called them proof of destiny. Each failed raid was a message. Brute force wasn't enough. Even the heaviest British bombs left nothing more than scorched craters on the surface. The bunkers stood untouched, their construction a symbol of Nazi arrogance. Hitler's belief that his 1,000-year Reich could hide beneath the earth itself. Inside these underground fortresses, engineers worked on new nightmares. The V-1 and V-2 weapons. Flying bombs and supersonic rockets that would one day rain terror on London. To the Allied command, the stakes couldn't have been higher. If these launch sites couldn't be destroyed before the rockets were operational, the war might tilt irreversibly in Germany's favor. The British Air Ministry faced a cruel dilemma. They could keep sending waves of bombers, losing men and machines, or they could admit what no one wanted to say aloud, that the enemy had built something truly indestructible. By late 1943, intelligence reports described entire command centers buried beneath cliffs, submarine pens sunk beneath concrete vaults as thick as a battleship's armor. Photographs taken from reconnaissance aircraft showed craters littering the ground around these sites. Thousands of tons of bombs dropped for little effect. A veteran pilot described it bitterly. "We could see the explosions from miles away." But when the dust cleared, the bunkers were still there, like they were laughing at us. For the men flying those missions, it was demoralizing. For the planners back in London, it was infuriating. And for one quiet engineer, it was unacceptable. In a small office far from the front lines, a middle-aged man with round spectacles studied the same reconnaissance photos. Not as a soldier, but as a problem solver. His name was Barnes Wallis. And where others saw impenetrable walls, he saw a flaw in physics waiting to be exploited. Wallis had already earned a reputation as an unconventional thinker. He wasn't a fighter pilot, or a general, or even a bomber designer in the traditional sense. He was an engineer, a man obsessed with mathematics, structure, and efficiency. To him, war wasn't just a contest of firepower, it was a contest of minds. He believed that there was always a precise way to defeat even the most impossible problem, if you could just find the right equation. As news of failed missions poured in, Wallis began sketching in silence. Long nights filled with scribbled notes, geometry diagrams, and calculations written in pencil and ink. He knew the problem wasn't the courage of the pilots or the size of their bombs. It was something deeper, something fundamental. Traditional bombs exploded on impact, wasting most of their energy sideways into the air. But what if a bomb could strike with such speed, such precision, that it would burrow deep underground before exploding? What if the blast could shake the very foundations of the bunker, collapsing it from below rather than smashing it from above? The idea was radical. It went against every rule of conventional bombing. And in 1943, the British war establishment wasn't exactly friendly to radical ideas. The air chiefs demanded immediate results: more bombs, More planes, more sorties. They had little patience for experiments or theoretical inventions. To them, Wallis's sketches were the dreams of an academic, not the solution to a real war. But Wallis was different from most inventors. He had something they didn't: absolute conviction. He once wrote, "If the brute force of men cannot reach the enemy, then it must be the mind that finds a way." The mind against the machine, brains versus bunkers. Still, to prove his idea, Wallis would need more than belief. He would need resources, support, and time. Three things that wartime Britain had very little of. And so began a quiet war inside the war. A battle of memos, experiments, and arguments fought not on the battlefield, but in meeting rooms and testing ranges. While the bombers kept flying and the cities kept burning, Barnes Wallis fought to convince the Air Ministry that his so-called earthquake bomb could succeed where everything else had failed. His proposal was simple in theory, but terrifying in scale. A bomb so massive it would pierce the ground like a spear, burrow deep beneath the surface, and unleash an explosion so violent that it would cause the entire bunker to collapse under its own weight. No one had ever built anything like it before. It would be heavier than any aircraft could carry. It would require re-engineering the bombers themselves, and the physics behind it, the very idea that shock waves through the ground could destroy what surface explosions could not, seemed too far-fetched to many of his peers. In meeting after meeting, officials dismissed him. One called it an engineer's fantasy. Another said it was a waste of time when we're fighting for our lives. But Wallis wouldn't give up. Every rejection only made him more determined. He refined his calculations, adjusted his designs, and waited for the right moment. A moment when desperation might finally make people listen. That moment was coming. Because as 1944 approached, Hitler's bunkers weren't just surviving, they were multiplying. And soon, the British would face a grim reality. They had run out of ordinary answers. All that remained was one extraordinary idea. One man's blueprint for the impossible. And when that blueprint finally left the drawing board, it would change the course of the air war and prove that even in the darkest hours of history, the sharpest weapon is not forged from steel, but from the human mind. In the spring of 1943, Barnes Wallis was a man out of step with the world around him. While most of Britain was focused on surviving the nightly bombings, he was obsessed with a single idea, a weapon that could reach deep beneath the ground and crush Hitler's fortresses from below. But in the eyes of the military establishment, Wallis was a dreamer. Brilliant, yes, but impractical. He had already gained fame for his bouncing bomb, used in the Dam Busters raid, a daring success that had blown open Germany's industrial heartland. Yet instead of resting on that triumph, Wallis was already thinking beyond it. He wanted something bigger, something that could end the war itself. He called it the earthquake bomb. To understand what he meant, you have to think like he did, not as a soldier, but as an engineer. Conventional bombing relied on blast and fire. It was brute force, an attempt to smash the enemy's walls with sheer impact. Wallis saw the flaw. The energy of each explosion was wasted outward into the air. He wanted to send that energy downward, to use the earth itself as a weapon. His design was simple on paper, but staggering in practice. A 12,000-pound steel bomb, dropped from extreme altitude, that would strike the ground at nearly the speed of sound, bury itself deep, and detonate underground. The result would not just be an explosion, but an earthquake, shock waves rippling through rock and concrete, shaking the target to pieces. But to the Air Ministry, it sounded insane. They were already struggling to produce enough conventional bombs for the nightly air raids. The Lancaster bombers that carried those bombs were operating at their limits. And now, Wallis wanted them to lift something far heavier. A bomb so massive it would tear the wings off any plane that tried to carry it. In meeting after meeting, his superiors dismissed him. He was told to focus on existing designs. One officer famously told him, "We don't need an earthquake, Wallis. We need results." But Wallis wasn't built to give up. He believed the problem wasn't resources. It was imagination. At home, his family watched as he worked late into the night, hunched over his drawing board, surrounded by notebooks filled with calculations. He was meticulous, almost obsessive. Every line had to be perfect. Every curve had to serve a purpose. His wife once recalled that he would wake up in the middle of the night to jot down formulas, afraid he'd lose the thought if he waited until morning. He carried the war in his mind, a war of equations, angles, and trajectories. But as the months passed, his frustration grew. He knew his design would work, but he couldn't convince anyone powerful enough to fund it. Even the scientists at the Royal Aircraft Establishment were skeptical. They questioned his penetration theory. Could a bomb really dive deep enough without disintegrating? Could a plane even release such a weapon safely? Every doubt, every dismissal, was another wall between him and reality. Yet Wallis believed that the logic of physics was on his side. He once said quietly, "The laws of nature are not subject to committee approval." Finally, unable to win support through bureaucracy, Wallis took a risk that could have ended his career. He bypassed his superiors and sent his proposal directly to the Prime Minister's scientific advisors, and eventually to Winston Churchill himself. The gamble paid off. Churchill was intrigued. He had a soft spot for unconventional thinkers, men who defied the rules to get results. But even with Churchill's interest, there was no guarantee of success. Wallis was granted permission for limited experiments. No funding, no large-scale production, just permission to prove his theory in miniature. At a test site on the English coast, he and a small team began dropping scaled-down models of his bomb from old aircraft. The first tests were failures. The prototypes broke apart mid-air. Some detonated too early. Others buried themselves so deep they couldn't even be found. Each failure meant weeks of re-engineering, recalculating shapes, adjusting tail fins, refining the casing. It was relentless, exhausting work. But something was happening. With each test, the data improved. Wallis's predictions about penetration and shockwave spread were proving correct. The physics was sound. He just needed a bigger bomb, and a government brave enough to build it. Then, in mid-1944, as V-1 rockets began striking London, the mood in Whitehall changed. The British public was terrified. These flying bombs were hitting civilian neighborhoods without warning. People wanted revenge. And suddenly, the idea of destroying the launch bunkers, once thought impossible, became a priority. Desperation opened the door that logic couldn't. Wallis's blueprints were pulled from the archives. The ministry authorized the construction of a full-scale prototype, codenamed Tallboy. It would weigh 6 tons. It would be 30 feet long, and it would be unlike anything ever built before. Wallis's team worked around the clock. Machinists in secret factories forged the bomb's massive steel casing. Aerodynamic engineers modified the design for stability during its supersonic dive. Lancaster bombers were stripped of armor and defensive guns to carry the enormous load. Every detail was refined to perfection, from the spiral tail fins to the fuse timing designed to delay detonation until the bomb had buried itself deep below the surface. For the first time, Wallis's vision was taking physical form. But success brought new fear. If the bomb failed in testing, it would not just destroy his reputation. It could end the entire project, and possibly the lives of the crew who carried it. Wallis was acutely aware of that burden. He visited the airfields personally, explaining to the pilots the mechanics of the weapon, walking them through the physics that could either save them or kill them. He treated them not as soldiers, but as collaborators in an experiment that could change the war. By June 1944, the first tall boy was ready. It gleamed like a polished spear, elegant, massive, and terrifyingly beautiful. In his notebook that night, Wallis wrote a single line: "Now it must justify itself." The next morning, at a secret testing range, a Lancaster bomber lumbered down the runway, carrying the most ambitious weapon Britain had ever built. Wallis watched from the control tower as it climbed into the gray English sky. Every second felt like an hour. Every vibration of the plane's engines echoed in his chest. He had risked everything on one idea. That thought and calculation could break what brute force never could. As the bomb fell, it screamed through the clouds, slicing the air faster than sound. It struck the ground with such speed that the earth itself seemed to jump. A second later, a roar, deep and resonant, as the shock wave rolled outward across the testing range. When the dust cleared, the observers stood in silence. Where the bomb had landed, there was no crater, only a deep, perfect wound in the earth, the shape of the weapon itself. Wallis's calculations had been correct. The bomb hadn't just exploded, it had penetrated. It had proven that the unthinkable was possible. For the first time, the dreamer had made reality boo to mathematics. But what no one knew yet was just how devastating this new weapon would become once it reached the battlefield. The British had just unlocked a weapon that could shake the very foundations of Hitler's empire. And soon, they would use it. By the summer of 1944, the Allies were on the offensive. D-Day had opened the gates of Europe, but Hitler still had his aces, the underground fortresses that protected his secret weapons. Deep beneath the forests of northern France, German engineers worked inside massive bunkers built to launch the V-1 and V-2 rockets. Concrete roofs, 12 feet thick. Walls designed to absorb direct hits from any known bomb. They were meant to be untouchable. That was about to change. Barnes Wallis's weapon, the tall boy, was now ready for combat. Its mission, to destroy the very foundations of Hitler's underground empire. Each bomb weighed more than 12,000 pounds. Each one could fall from over 20,000 feet, reaching near supersonic speed before impact. And each one was guided not by advanced technology, but by the courage and precision of the men who dropped it. The pilots of number 617 Squadron, the same elite unit that had carried out the Dambusters raid, were chosen to deliver the new weapon. They were experts in precision bombing, used to impossible missions. But even they were shocked when they saw the tall boy for the first time. It barely fit beneath the belly of their Lancasters. The crews joked that if the bomb didn't kill the Germans, it might kill the bomber itself. On the morning of June 8, 1944, the order came. Target: the Saumur railway tunnel in occupied France, a critical supply route being used by German reinforcements headed toward Normandy. The tunnel ran through a solid limestone hill. Conventional bombs had failed to collapse it. Wallis believed Tallboy could. The weather was clear. The squadron climbed higher and higher, past the altitude limit most Lancasters were ever meant to reach. Engines strained. Airmen fought to keep the aircraft steady under the massive weight. At over 18,000 feet, they leveled off and began their bombing run. Down below, the German defenders saw the glint of bombers miles above and opened fire. But at that altitude, flak burst harmlessly in the distance. The bombardier lined up the crosshairs. "Bomb's gone," he called. The tall boy slipped free, a smooth, almost graceful fall. For a few seconds, it seemed motionless. Then it began to spin, stabilizing itself, accelerating toward the earth at nearly 800 miles per hour. When it struck, the ground convulsed. A column of dust and rock erupted into the sky. Seconds later, the hillside collapsed inward. The tunnel crushed. Hundreds of tons of rock buried the railway alive. The first combat use of the tall boy was a complete success. Wallis's dream had crossed from theory into history. Within weeks, 617 Squadron began striking other hardened targets, V-weapon sites, submarine pens, and the massive concrete bunker at Wyzerns, known to the Allies as the Dome. It was one of Hitler's most ambitious fortresses, a mountain of reinforced concrete meant to launch the V-2 rockets that could have turned the tide of the war. Repeated attacks with conventional bombs had done nothing. Then the tall boys arrived. Each hit sent tremors through the ground like miniature earthquakes. Cracks appeared in the bunker walls. Support pillars snapped. Entire chambers collapsed under the shock. German engineers tried to repair the damage, but it was hopeless. Even unfinished, the site was abandoned. The V-2 program's launch operations were delayed for months, buying Britain precious time. Reports flooded back to London. Target obliterated. Penetration confirmed. Structural collapse achieved. Barnes Wallis had done the impossible. He had built a bomb that broke physics in the service of victory, but he wasn't finished. Wallis believed that even the tall boy could be improved. He began designing an even larger version, a weapon so massive that no existing aircraft could carry it without major modification. He called it the Grand Slam. Its weight, 22,000 pounds. Its nickname, Earthquake Bomb. The RAF gave him one modified squadron and full authority to proceed. It was an engineering nightmare. The bombers needed reinforced wings, new bomb bays, stripped armor, and a new flight ceiling. But by early 1945, the Grand Slam was ready. Its target, Hitler's ultimate fortresses, the Bielefeld Viaduct, Hamburg submarine pens, and the Valentine U-boat bunker, the largest reinforced concrete structure in Europe. Each of these sites had defied every previous attack. Each was considered bomb-proof. Until now. On March 14, 1945, British bombers carrying Grand Slams took off from Lincolnshire airfields. At 22,000 feet, the air grew thin and icy. The pilots could barely control their aircraft, but they pressed on. Below them, the Bielefeld Viaduct stretched across the valley, a key supply route for German armor and troops. As the lead bomber approached the drop zone, the pilot steadied the aircraft. The bombardier whispered under his breath, "Now." The bomb detached and began its deadly fall. Observers later described it as a comet of steel. When it hit, the explosion was indescribable, a plume of earth and smoke hundreds of feet high. Then, silence. Moments later, a deep rumble rolled through the valley as the viaduct simply vanished. Bridges, tracks, and supports collapsed like paper. Even German witnesses admitted later, "We thought it was an earthquake." Over the next weeks, the Grand Slam would repeat that performance across Germany. The once invincible U-boat pens, the command centers, the concrete giants that had mocked Allied air power, all began to crumble. At Valentin, near Bremen, the massive submarine bunker built from over 500,000 tons of concrete was struck directly. The Grand Slam pierced its roof, detonated inside, and tore open a crater 50 feet wide. The structure was rendered useless before it was even completed. When the RAF photographs arrived in London, they showed a simple truth. The age of the fortress was over. In less than a year, the weapons born from one man's imagination had changed the landscape of the war. Not through greater numbers, not through luck, but through intellect, persistence, and vision. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew Wallis personally. The man who had spent his life designing ways to protect airships and build bridges had created the most destructive conventional weapon in history. Yet for Wallis, there was no celebration. He watched the results with quiet satisfaction, but also with sorrow. He once wrote, "To do evil that good may come. That is the cross all of us must bear." The British press never fully told his story during the war. It was too secret, too technical, too strange to explain to a public hungry for heroes. But among the pilots who flew those missions, his name was spoken with reverence. One of them said simply, "We didn't drop bombs. We dropped his faith in physics." And that faith, the belief that reason could triumph over brute force, became one of the quiet turning points of the entire conflict. By early 1945, Hitler's war machine was disintegrating. Factories destroyed, supplies crippled, command centers shattered. And though it was just one part of a vast Allied effort, the Tallboy and Grand Slam had proven a single, undeniable truth. Brains had finally beaten bunkers. When the war finally ended in 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were flattened, empires broken, and the air that once echoed with bombers now hung in uneasy silence. For the men of 617 Squadron, the missions were over. The same crews who had flown through hell to drop the world's most powerful bombs now found themselves returning to quiet towns and empty airfields. Their war had ended not with fanfare, but with fatigue and a deep, almost haunting, awareness of what they had unleashed. Among them, one name lingered like a quiet legend: Barnes Wallis. He wasn't a soldier. He never held a gun. Yet his mind had struck blows more devastating than any battalion. From a tiny workshop filled with chalk dust and blueprints, he had changed the physics of war. But when the headlines came, they celebrated generals and politicians, not engineers. Wallis went back to work in near anonymity. He kept inventing aircraft designs, rescue systems, new concepts of aerodynamics. But the shadow of his wartime work never truly left him. He later wrote, "I have been called a destroyer, but my only wish was to shorten the killing." That line captures the paradox of his life and the entire story you've just heard, because this wasn't a tale about a bomb. It was a story about the mind, about how thought, creativity, and courage can overcome even the hardest concrete walls built by tyranny. The Tallboy and Grand Slam were symbols of something deeper, that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun, or a tank, or an army. It's an idea, wielded by someone who refuses to give up when the world says, impossible. Hitler had his bunkers, his armies, his concrete empires. But in the end, a quiet English engineer, a man who built bridges and airships, outthought them all. That's what broke the myth of Nazi invincibility. Not just overwhelming force, but ingenuity. A nation that fought with brains when it had little else left. In the post-war years, the ruins of those bunkers still stood, silent, immovable, scarred. But inside their shattered walls lay a lesson that no fortress, no matter how thick, can stand forever against the will to innovate. Modern engineers still study Wallis's designs. Every precision-guided bomb, every bunker buster used today, traces its roots back to his notebooks and experiments. The earthquake bomb was the grandfather of modern smart weapons. But Wallis himself never glorified it. He often said that his inventions were born from desperation, not ambition. He saw himself not as a destroyer, but as a problem solver, and when peace came, he dedicated his remaining years to education, helping young engineers dream beyond war. It's easy now to see the story in black and white, genius versus evil, good triumphing through intellect. But real history is never that simple. Behind every triumph of engineering lies a human cost. Crews who never came home, civilians caught in the blast, moral lines blurred by necessity. That's what gives this story its weight. It isn't just about victory, it's about what victory costs. As one of the surviving airmen later said, "We won, yes. But we learned that even brilliance has a burden." Barnes Wallis carried that burden for the rest of his life. He lived long enough to see men walk on the moon, an achievement powered by the same physics he once used for war. And when he was asked what he felt about his legacy, he replied quietly, "I am grateful that my work helped to end suffering. I only wish it had come sooner." There's something profoundly human in that. The recognition that intellect, for all its triumphs, is still bound by conscience. So when we look back at the story of the secret British weapon that destroyed Hitler's bunkers, it's not just a tale of destruction. It's a testament to creativity under fire, and to a mind that refused to accept defeat. It reminds us that real strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly in a workshop, sketching blueprints in the dark, because the real weapon wasn't steel or explosives. It was thought, and thought, once unleashed, can change the course of history. If this story interested you, subscribe and give it a like to help others discover real World War II history.